And so we're going to be looking at that passage from Ecclesiastes from chapter 1, verse 12, through to the end of chapter 2. Now, I wonder, where do you look for satisfaction and for meaning in life? Where do you look for those things? Or perhaps where do most people look for those things? Perhaps you look to relationships and to family. Perhaps you look to work or to sort of projects and things. Perhaps you look to leisure. Where it is that you look for meaning. You know, it's something which everyone is looking for. Everyone wants to find meaning, and everyone wants to find that kind of satisfaction that comes from, doing something well and finding that meaning. And this is why I think looking at Ecclesiastes is so helpful for us, because I think it helps us to know where to look or where not to look for these things. And the words, I think, are really striking, aren't they, if you're not used to them, where it comes up and it says, as it says we looked at last week, meaningless, everything is meaningless. And in our passage today, again, this is what we find. He says in verse 14, I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, are chasing after the wind. And just to remind you that meaningless just means, like, if you breathe out on a cold day and you see the vapour there just for a second and then it disappears. That's the sense of the word. It's just empty, vapour. Vanity is the traditional way it was translated. And that's the sense of it. And so whoever the teacher is, perhaps Solomon, he is saying, look, I've tried it all. I've tried everything. And all of it is the same. And he even says in verse 18, for with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. So he almost says, in fact he does say really, that wisdom is almost the worst thing of all. That wisdom is the worst thing. Why is that? Well, he goes on in chapter 2 to think about the different aspects that he's looked at. So he looks at pleasures in verses 1 to 3 of chapter 2. Laughter, he talks about pleasure, wine, and so on. And those are all of those sort of good experiences, but they don't last very long, do they? You think about if you have a really good meal or something, you might enjoy it for a few minutes, but at the end of the day, does it really bring you lasting satisfaction? And the answer, according to the teacher here, is no. It might satisfy you for a few minutes or an hour or two, but it won't last. That's the point of it. That's what he's trying to say. And then he says in verse 4, I undertook great projects. So he's built houses, planted vineyards, he's made gardens and parks, and planted trees, he's made reservoirs, and he's had slaves and owned things, silver and gold, male and female singers, it says, and a harem as well. So he's had everything, every kind of pleasure that a man can own, he has had it. Did that bring him satisfaction? As it says in verse 10, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labour, and this was the reward of all my toil. Yet, when I surveyed all that my hands had done, what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. So he did all of these things. He owned all of these things. And at the end of it, it was just all meaningless. As he says, it didn't bring him any lasting satisfaction. I think this is an experiment that a lot of people in our society are running as well. I thought at the start about where people find meaning, and a lot of people are trying to find meaning in things, or in their career, or perhaps in their families. And if you look for ultimate meaning in those things, you won't be satisfied at the end of the day, because those things don't bring ultimate satisfaction. They might last for a while, but at the end of the day, they don't bring lasting satisfaction. And even as the teacher says, wisdom and folly are meaningless. He says in verse 14, chapter 2, verse 14, the wise have eyes in their heads, while the fool walks in the darkness. But I came to realise that the same fate overtakes them both. So he says, like we were looking at last week, what's the point of anything? What's the point in living rightly and wisely when we're all just going to die anyway? That just makes fools of everyone, whether you live wisely or whether you live foolishly at the end of the day. Both wise and foolish suffer the same fate. And then he delves into this idea about death a bit more in verses 17 to 23. He thinks about what happens to everything we gain. And he says in verses 18 and 19, I hated all the things I had toiled for, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. And who knows whether that person will be wise or foolish. Yet they will have control over all the fruit of my toil, into which I poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. So he says, at the end of the day, you can have all sorts. You can have as much money as you like. You can be a king. You can be the ruler of nations. You're just going to have to leave it to the person who comes after you. That's going to be your fate. However much you have or don't have, you're just going to have to leave it at the end of the day. And then he says in verses 22 and 23, what do people get for all the toil and anxious striving which they labour? All their days their work is grief and pain. Even at night their minds do not rest. This too is meaningless. It made me think actually of the famous prayer from the funeral service in the Book of Common Prayer. Man that is born of woman hath but a short time to live, and is full of misery. He cometh up and is cut down like a flower. He fleeth as it were a shadow, and never continueth in one stay. And I think that's the thing, isn't it? That death makes a mockery of life. Death makes a mockery of life, if that's all there is. If that's all there is, then there is no point to anything, is there? There's no point to any work that we do. There's no point to any good things that we might get, because they don't last. They don't really give us any satisfaction, and we're just going to die anyway. And if that's all there is, we may as well give up. And it's interesting, isn't it, that a lot of people who don't believe in anything after death still devote themselves to all these things. It's like we can't help ourselves as human beings. You know, we were made for meaning. We are made for more, but we can't escape it. And yet, some people still think, cannot accept that, if death is the end, then all of our lives are just meaningless. So this is what the writer, the teacher comes on to at the end of our passage there, verses 24 to 26, and this is where we're going to finish. This is his conclusion. So, well, what's the point of anything? He says, a person can do nothing better to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. So, it says life and work and the pleasures that we have are a gift. But, he says, this is from the hand of God. So these things begin to make sense when we realise that the pleasures and the good things of this life, work, family, a nice meal or whatever, these things are a gift from God. And that when we accept them and understand them as a gift from God, then it starts to make sense of our lives. He says, without Him, without God, who can eat or find enjoyment? So without God, if we chase after all of those things for our satisfaction, for our pleasure, then they won't give us satisfaction or pleasure. Not for very long anyway, because there will be an empty hole inside. Do you know that phrase which sometimes gets said, everyone has a God-shaped hole. And I'm not a huge fan of that phrase, but I think it does get at something true, which is we've all got a craving for something beyond the things of this life. And that if we try and fill that hole with the things of this life, it will never fit. It will never be quite right. And a lot of celebrities find this. I don't know if you've read stories of people who they get to the top, they get to be famous, they get to have money or fame and celebrity, whatever it is that they crave, and they get there and then find actually it's empty. I think it was Madonna, I believe it was her who said, people think that being famous is all about, people recognising your money. And you know what? They're absolutely right. And that's the thing, isn't it? That, people recognise you and you have lots of money. What do you gain? And that is the truth, isn't it? And without God, the pleasures of life and life that we have are meaningless. And what this session this week is entitled is Bursting the Bubble. That's the chapter of the book, the Living Life Backward book that I mentioned, Bursting the Bubble. And that's the thing that Ecclesiastes is trying to do, that the teacher is trying to do, is to burst the bubble and to say to us, look, where are we really looking for our satisfaction? Because if we're looking for our satisfaction in all of these earthly things, then it won't satisfy. But if we look to God, then we can accept these things as a gift, and they will satisfy, because we'll see them as a gift from the one who gives them. We'll see these things as a gift, and that is the right place for all of the pleasures of life to be. And I do wonder if the whole kind of situation with COVID is actually, I think, a message from God, actually, to our society. And saying, well, where do you find your satisfaction? Because at the moment, all of our lives, so many of the things that we would have relied on to give us pleasure and so on, have been taken away or restricted. And God's saying, now, where do you really find your satisfaction? Where do you really find your satisfaction? So let me finish with a couple of quotes from the Bible, which I thought were good to finish with. The first thing is Psalm 90, verse 12, where it says the Psalm of Moses, the man of God. And Psalm 90, verse 12 says, "Teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom." Teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. So when we think about death, when we think about pleasures, we can ask God to give us a heart of wisdom to understand how to live our lives and where we find our satisfaction and pleasure. And the final thing is these wonderful words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 6, famous words. Matthew chapter 6, verse 33. He says, "Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well." And that's, I think, a good place to finish. And I think that's a very Ecclesiastes message, actually. Seek first God's kingdom and his righteousness, and all of the other things will be given to you as well. If you seek all the other things, you won't find them. If you seek God, seek his kingdom, seek his righteousness, all these other things will be yours as well. I think that's a good place to finish with.